Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are 10 potential legendary weapons I think we might see in Kobolds and Catacombs. Now, if you didn't know, of course, there are going to be legendary weapons provided for each and every class in the new expansion, 2 of which that you'll see behind me have already been revealed, but I was curious what the other 7 classes might get in regards to legendary weapons, so I decided to whip up some custom cards of my own to take a look at what I would like to see as far as strong weapons go for each of these different classes. Now, keep in mind as I move through all of these card designs that I created that I kept a couple things in mind. Namely, I wanted these cards to be very powerful because they are legendary weapons. They need to stand out. They need to be impactful. Rarely are they going to be build-arounds, like your whole deck is not going to be centered around the thematic aspect of the weapon, but it needs to be good enough to run in a variety of different decks, particularly along certain archetypes. And then secondarily, I also designed most of these in a way that they're still good against weapon removal. So in other words, a lot of the value is more immediate, and even if it gets removed by Harrison Jones or one of the oozes, you still get something out of the card. I think that's important for these legendary weapons to stand out and to actually make sense in the meta. Otherwise, the weapon removal that's available will just immediately kill them all. So all of that said, let's go ahead and jump into my custom cards here, my 10 potential legendary weapons for Kobolds and Catacombs. Up first here I have my take on the new rogue legendary weapon, the Kingslayers. And before I get into this one, I just really quickly want to address that there was a leak posted on Reddit of an advertisement for Kobolds and Catacombs, which showed the artwork for this card and the next card on my list. So I wanted to get to those right away. We didn't see anything about the stats or even necessarily the class that these cards would be played in, but if you know Warcraft lore, you can identify both of the weapons, and this artwork is in fact corresponding to the Kingslayers, an artifact weapon in the Legion expansion of World of Warcraft. So I'm pretty sure this will either be the Kingslayers or one of the Kingslayers with their independent names, and it will almost certainly belong to Rogue. The next weapon, as we'll discuss in a minute, is a little less clear-cut, but still I have some ideas. But as far as the Kingslayers go, the reason I created this card is to finally make the Rogue itself a true assassin. Rogues have always had a ton of burst damage, but usually it's on the back of charging minions like Leroy Jenkins. Back in the day, Miracle Rogue doing 21 points of burst damage was absurd, but it never felt like the Rogue itself was doing the dirty deed, and I wanted Kingslayers to make up for that. I wanted a powerhouse weapon that just allows the Rogue to kill the opponent outright. And that's right, the Kingslayers is 3 Pyroblasts in a single weapon. It's a total of 30 damage over 3 turns. It is absolutely bonkers when it comes to just raw damage. Now, of course, this doesn't have an effect or any kind of text, which might seem odd for a legendary weapon, but the stats here are just so remarkable that I thought it still deserved a legendary designation. Some people out there are probably freaking out and saying this is too powerful. You can't give 30 damage to a single card. You can't put 3 Pyroblasts in one card. That's just totally absurd. I hear you. I wanted to get that out of the way now. Go ahead and leave your complaints in the comments below. You'll probably have more in the future if you keep watching the video. But here's my take on the Kingslayers, right? Of course, weapons are so susceptible to multiple things. They're susceptible to freeze effects. They're susceptible to taunt minions, of course. They can't push through taunts without some other aspect. And they're also susceptible to weapon removal, the oozes and the Harrison Jones we already talked about. So this card immediately has 3 weaknesses that really deny its game plan, which is just outright killing your opponent most of the time. You're not going to be wanting to trade this into 8/8s. You're going to die doing that. You're going to want to send this to the face. So 3 weaknesses right off the bat. Now, of course, Rogue as a class does have ways to avoid some of those weaknesses, and that's where I think the fun interactions for Kingslayers appear. You can build a deck with saps and vanishes that help you empower your Kingslayers to actually push face and get that damage through. But of course, when you start adding vanishes and saps and a 10-mana weapon that's going to be sitting in your hand, suddenly your deck is very inconsistent. So I think there is a real aspect of balancing and finding a deck list here that would make sense and would help keep the Kingslayers in check. But the mere fact that it exists gives you an opportunity to build your deck in a specific way and look for damage, and it gives Rogue this really interesting tool that we've never seen before. It makes Malkarok and Blingtron a little more ridiculous, as will most of the weapons, in fact, in this set. But I just want a big, just dominating assassin deadly weapon like this one to exist in Hearthstone, so that's exactly why I made the Kingslayers. So now let's move on to the second weapon where the artwork was leaked, and the leak clearly identifies the Bloodhoof Rune Spear, a weapon that is used by Cairn Bloodhoof, as you'll notice there in the name, and is essentially passed down across the generations among Taurens, and in fact they all inscribe a little piece of their history upon the Bloodhoof Rune Spear, apparently. So I wanted to convey that aspect of the weapon in lore in the actual card here, and I did assign this weapon to Shaman just because it's a pretty shamanistic kind of tribe, and of course it looks a bit like a shaman weapon with all those feathers, although I think you could make the argument that this could also be a warrior weapon. But for the Bloodhoof Rune Spear, how I conveyed this aspect of the lore is that I gave it an effect here. Whenever your hero attacks, you summon a random friendly minion that died this game. So in other words, you know, those who have died in the past are brought back and remembered thanks to the Bloodhoof Rune Spear. So this is a 5 mana 3/3, a little bit understated for a 5 cost weapon ultimately, just because the attack value isn't really that high. Of course, it's got a solid durability, but you get all that back, of course, because you're summoning minions that died previously. So you have that resurrect kind of effect. And occasionally, yes, that can resurrect some absurd things, and this can be an incredibly high-value weapon, but that is balanced most fairly of all in the class of Shaman, which I gave this weapon to, because Shaman has totems. They have a lot of weak minions that are just being played and dying often, so sometimes this weapon's going to whiff and you're going to get a Shaman, sometimes it's going to be a little bit bigger and you're going to get something awesome, a lot of times something in the middle as well. So in other words, the class that this card exists in, I think, balances it by itself. There is the potential, of course, as we've seen with like Big Priest, where you resurrect things, it can get out of hand and Big Priest can feel really terrible. I don't think that's nearly as likely in Bloodhoof Rune Spear because you do just have to play those smaller minions, and Shaman typically finds a lot of its strength in smaller minions. And if you're playing this in the late game after you've played a lot of that big stuff, of course, it's just going to be even more inconsistent because by then so many different things have died. So outside of some very specific Barnes scenarios on 4 into Bloodhoof Rune Spear on 5, it's just not as predictable as something like the Eternal Servitude package and the Shadow Essence and all of the shenanigans that Big Priest can provide. So I don't think it'll be overpowered in that regard, but it's still going to be a really strong weapon because if it works, you're getting a solid 3/3 weapon, which is going to trade into the board a ton. And, of course, you're just potentially getting 3 minions, some of which are going to be great. So that's a lot of value packed into a 5-mana weapon. Sometimes, in fact, maybe too much, but as I said when I opened this video, I'm designing these to be very powerful, and I'm designing these to give you some immediate effect. So, worst case scenario, this is often going to be a 5-mana 3/1 weapon that summons you a minion. And that's really not that bad. That could, in fact, be pretty good if you get a 5, 6, 7 cost minion that you want to run in your deck. Things like Wide Eyes, for instance, would be ridiculous with Bloodhoof Rune Spear. But then other times you're going to get 2 or 3 minions, and this card is going to feel very much like a legendary weapon that conveys the aspects of the actual weapon from lore as well, which is a lot of fun. So this is my take on a good, fitting card for Shaman, and a nice little tribute there to Cairn Bloodhoof once again. So now let's move on to my Warlock weapon. This is Ulthalesh. This is another weapon that is a Legion artifact weapon, and this one is really called Ulthalesh the Deadwind Harvester. So I definitely wanted to convey that aspects of harvesting souls, and I think that's exactly what this weapon design does. It's a 3-mana 0/3, which falls in line with the other caster kinds of weapons we've seen so far. The Priest and the Mage weapons, the real ones where they don't have an attack value. Blizzard made it pretty clear they didn't want to give attack weapons at a baseline to the caster classes, but this one does have the potential to gain attack, as you can see there from the card text. Whenever a minion dies while this weapon is equipped, it gains +1 attack. So essentially this weapon has all kinds of potential to punish your opponent thanks to all the AoE effects available to Warlock. Basically, if you cast this at the same time you're playing a Hellfire and you're killing, 4 or 5 minions, even if you play this weapon and then trade in a bunch of your board and kill 4 or 5 things, suddenly you have like a 3-mana 5/3 weapon, and that's just totally absurd. You could compare this in a lot of ways, I guess, to cards like Flesh-Eating Ghoul, but of course Flesh-Eating Ghoul is really susceptible on the board. Ulthalesh is not quite as susceptible. It's only susceptible to weapon removal, unlike just trades and all kinds of other removal. So it takes one specific kind of card to kill this attack value. And if your opponent doesn't have that, this thing can snowball really, really quickly. It can become a 7/3, a 10/3. It could just go absolutely nuts. And that's a lot of damage packed into a 3-cost card. And of course, the ability that you can play this alongside so many other things like your Shadow Flames and your Hellfires of the world means that you can often just make this like a 3-mana 6/3 and just attack that one time, and suddenly it's worth the 3 mana. Just getting 6 damage for 3 mana is really, really good. And if you ever get 2 or 3 charges, it's just absurdly good. And even if you just get a 3/3 out of it, you know, that's not really that bad. So I like the balance here between a good baseline card that's great for one attack as a kind of a combo in a single turn, but also the potential for it to snowball into something completely ridiculous. There's a really fine kind of gradient there that's interesting to explore, and just depending upon the game and the meta and the deck you're playing against and the cards you expect them to have, using Ulthalesh becomes a really interesting strategy decision. Do I try to use these charges immediately? Do I save it up and go nuts with it later and just hit them for 10? Do they have removal? Are they just waiting and baiting out Ulthalesh to become stronger before they use the removal? There's all kinds of different shenanigans that can happen there, and I really like that aspect of Ulthalesh. I think it makes for an interesting, difficult decision kind of card for both opponents, and those are the kinds of cards that I like to see in Hearthstone. So up next, let's move on to a hunter weapon. This is Thoradul, the Star's Fury, and you might know this weapon if you played in the Burning Crusade expansion of World of Warcraft. This was a legendary weapon that was awarded sometimes for killing Kil'jaeden, basically the final boss of that expansion. And here I made this a 6-mana 4/3 weapon, so similar stats to something like Vine Cleaver, for instance, but a little cheaper. But a very powerful effect on this card as well. Whenever your hero attacks, you add a random shot spell to your hand. And this is some wording I basically borrowed from the new arena cards that Blizzard proposed at BlizzCon. They proposed one similar to this, but it was a spell that would add a random shot spell to your hand. And shot spell means things like multi-shot, explosive shot, arcane shot, etc. I think there are a couple others and perhaps even more coming in the new expansion. So essentially, this is a little bit of a card draw engine in a late game card, which I really like for Hunter. I think this could be used in more of a control Hunter kind of deck. This isn't the sort of thing you'd probably want to use in an aggro deck, even though it does technically bundle a lot of damage together. I'm seeing it more as a mid-range tool that helps you, maybe clear a minion, apply a little bit of pressure, but also add a valuable asset to your hand. If you get that explosive shot, this is, a very strong weapon, similar to something like Vine Cleaver, that also generated you a huge control or removal style tool. Of course, you could also just get 3 arcane shots out of this bad boy and just double down on the amount of damage it could do. So it's flexible based on the game state and what you're looking for, whether you're trying to apply that pressure or trying to stabilize and control your board. So I just, very high value kind of thing. It draws you 3 cards in an ideal scenario. Even if it only draws you 1 card and you just get to attack once because there's weapon removal, you're still getting a lot out of this. You're getting a card back for your mana expense, which is nice. So it is a little bit resilient in some ways to that weapon removal that exists. So just, nothing too fancy or crazy here. Just a nice high value kind of legendary that fits the theme, by the way, of Thoradul. I didn't mention when you it would basically provide magical arrows, I guess, whenever you it says whenever you pull the bowstring, you generate magical arrows, and that feels a bit like the card text here. Whenever you actually attack with this weapon, you are generating some magical shots that are added to your hand. So altogether, a nice little bundle of a card that makes sense to me. So now let's move on to one of my favorite cards in this list, and this one's pretty crazy. This is the Corrupted Ashbringer. Now, you've all probably seen Ashbringer, the weapon that you get off Tirion Fordring when he dies. This is the corrupted version of it. I'm not going to get into all the lore, but essentially, this is a corrupted version of that very same weapon. And in fact, the card feels a bit like a corrupted version of that very same weapon. This is a 5-mana 5/3, which is the exact same stat line as Ashbringer. But this time around, you're playing the Ashbringer first, and when the Ashbringer dies, you're actually going to summon a Tirion Fordring. So it's backwards, and there is a basis for this in the lore. Essentially, Tirion Fordring purifies the corrupted Ashbringer. So essentially, I'm saying when your corrupted Ashbringer dies, it's as if it was purified, and Tirion Fordring is there to do it. But that's not the only thing that's going to happen on the death rattle. You summon Tirion Fordring, but also you basically put a timer on yourself where your hero is destroyed at the end of your third turn after Ashbringer dies. So basically, you just have 3 additional turns to win the game or you instantly lose. It's just an auto loss. And I really like this design because if you look at this card, a 5-mana 5/3 is very strong. That's just strictly better than Arcanite Reaper. And if it's removed or if you use all the charges, you're getting an 8-mana minion that is one of the best minions in the game. So you're getting a just absurd amount of stuff for only 5 mana. And of course, you're also in some ways punishing weapon removal, which is an interesting aspect of this card. But you get a free Tyrion out of it when a weapon's already good. That's absurd. So there has to be some downside, some risk, right? If you're gonna take up the corrupted Ashbringer, I think your fate is sealed. You only have so long before the forces of good win out, so you better win the game by then. And essentially, you have, a 30 damage opportunity to do that, because of course you get 3 swings on the corrupted Ashbringer. You summon your Tyrion. He fights a little bit, helps you stabilize, does some extra damage. When he dies, you get a normal Ashbringer for another 15 damage or 3 swings. And of course, you have 3 turns to use that Ashbringer. If your Tyrion Forge Ring dies right away, if he lives a little while, you might have less. But it's just sort of an all-in, I have so much damage, so much value, so much stuff. I'm going to win this game because you just can't handle all of this pressure. So I think this would primarily be used as a top-end card in really aggressive, kind of all-in aggro paladin kinds of decks. You wouldn't want to use this in a control deck where you have the chance to stabilize, because then it would just doom you. But if you're planning to lose the game quickly anyway because you've used all of your resources and you're just pressuring your opponent a ton, this is exactly the kind of card that would fit that mentality perfectly. So I think this card would have a very strict kind of home, but it would work really, really well within that context. And I just love the idea of it and the lore of it and the theme of it. It all fits together really well. So Corrupted Ashbringer is probably, if not my favorite, one of my favorite cards in this list. And I would absolutely love to see this in Hearthstone. So now let's move on to the warrior weapon, Thunderfury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker. Now I did have to shorten the name there a little bit, of course. There's only so much room on Hearthstone cards. But this is one of the most iconic early legendaries in vanilla World of Warcraft. Anybody who played back then can certainly remember looking in awe upon any Thunderfury you saw. Now, based on the name and sort of the design of the cards, you might think this is a shaman weapon first and foremost. But really, warriors were typically the people who used it. And in fact, tanks most often used Thunderfury back in vanilla World of Warcraft because it was just an absurd tool for generating threat back then, which was very important, and also had some defensive capabilities because it would slow the attack rate of your opponents whenever you attacked them with Thunderfury. So warriors were the most common fit, and that's why I gave this to warrior instead of something like shaman, in case you're wondering. And for Thunderfury here, I did capture some of that defensive aspects of the card since it was sort of a tank weapon, most iconically in my mind, as opposed to other aspects. You could have given it Wind Fury or something. But I wanted it to feel like a warrior weapon and a tank weapon. So this is a 6-mana 4/2. Fairly expensive for a 4/2, but not totally out of line. You're basically paying a couple extra mana points than you normally would. But that's because the effect here for Thunderfury is so ridiculously good. Whenever your hero attacks, you reduce all enemy minions' attack to 0. Now, some people might be a little confused by the wording there. That's not only while your hero is attacking. The whenever is just the trigger that happens, but that's permanently setting all enemy minions' attack to 0. So if there are 3 things on board, you attack with Thunderfury, whether it's your face, the opponent's face, or a minion, all minions are going to be reduced to 0 attack. So it's like Aldor Peacekeeper's effect, except to 0 instead of 1, which means, of course, you can just take a free trade into something if you need to. It won't damage you, so it's a lot of defensive utility there. But also, you could just attack face and leave 3 helpless minions on the board. So outside of your opponent rebuffing those minions or playing a Flame Tongue Totem or something like that, they're just never going to get to attack. They're just stuck there. So it's almost like a Frost Nova in a lot of ways, but a permanent Frost Nova. And that's very, very good. That's really strong. It's such a powerful defensive tool. Theoretically, if your opponent had 7 things on board and you played Thunderfury, Blessed Blade, guess what? Their board is stuck. They may never be able to play another minion, and they might just lose the game that single turn. But of course, there's a lot of counterplay to a card like Thunderfury. If you know your opponent's running Thunderfury, you would never play 7 minions on the board. Also, it only has 2 charges, so this can only happen twice. So once they equip it, you know what's up, and you can really start to mind game your opponent. But of course, it also gives the warrior a lot of interesting tempo decisions and the ability to kind of make your opponent play a line they don't want to play, so it creates a ton of friction there. So I like how much play and counterplay are built into this card. It's still very susceptible to weapon removal, because if you do just get 1 charge out of this, it'd still be very good, but not quite as powerful. So Thunderfury Blessed Blade here to me feels like a very cool control warrior kind of card that would be fun to play and also a lot of fun to play against, because it would be challenging and difficult, but I'm sure you could figure out ways to not play too hard into this and still win games around it, and that would feel like a cool accomplishment and an interesting addition to the meta. So now let's move on to my second hunter weapon that I made for this list. This is Titan Strike. This is another one of the artifact weapons in the Legion expansion. This time around, it's essentially a Titan-based weapon. It was maybe the first ever, I think, actual gun introduced to Azeroth, made, I think, by Memoron, in fact. And it's just one of the artifact weapons, and the main aspect of Titan Strike in World of Warcraft is that when you equip it, it's a good weapon, but you also get to summon Hades, which is a wolf companion, which I'm also going to introduce into this card. When you equip Titan Strike, the 5-mana 1/5, the battle cry allows you to summon Hades. So Hades, what's his deal? Well, of course, he's a hunter minion. He's not a card you'd play necessarily, but, if he were returned to your hand, this is what he'd look like. But he would just be a 4/4 minion on board. He would be a beast, and in fact, he would give your weapon +4 attack. So this is kind of a 2-in-1 here with this weapon. A 5-mana 1/5, of course, is not very exciting, but a 5-mana 1/5 that gets a buff to a 5-mana 5/5 is incredibly strong. 5/5 is like Arcanite Reaper's Supreme, and that would just be so much raw damage. So basically, the ability of your weapon to remain very powerful is tied to the survival of this minion. As soon as Hades dies, your weapon becomes more mediocre once again. But I like the sort of balancing act here, right? If your weapon is removed by Harrison Jones or whatever else, you've got a nice little minion on board, right? You've got a 4/4 out of your 5 mana, and of course you also just immediately got 1/5 attack right off the bat, because as soon as you equip Titan Strike, it's a 5/5 right off the bat. So you get 1 attack for 5 no matter what. You get half of an Arcanite Reaper and a 4/4 minion guaranteed every time. If your opponent removes your weapon, you've still got your 4/4, and that's a pretty solid little guy. He's a beast. It's a contribution to the board. If your opponent kills the minion, then you've still got a little bit of weapon left over. A 1/4 might not be exciting, but that's still the kind of thing that allows you to ping, just pressure a little bit more damage, combo with other cards, etc., etc. So clearly you'd want to keep Hades alive to maximize the value on your Titan Strike. And Hunter does actually have some ways to do that, right? You can buff your Hades to make it a little sturdier. You can give it stealth with things like Crackling Razor Maw, because it is in fact a beast. So there's a potential here for Titan Strike to just be totally absurd as that 5/5 and just do 25 damage to your opponent's face and kill them in a hyper-aggressive Hunter deck, especially against Priest, who would have a nightmare of a time dealing with a 4/4 mana, or excuse me, a 4/4 minion on turn 5. Other classes wouldn't have nearly so much trouble, but still, they're going to have to use some mana, have to use some expenditures. You're still getting the 5 damage immediately, so you're getting a lot out of Titan Strike no matter what. And, if you had the opportunity to run a minion that was a 4-mana 4/4 that said equip a 5/1 weapon, and when that 5/1 weapon dies, turn it into a Light's Justice, that card would be in every deck. That card would be totally bonkers, and that's exactly what Titan Strike is. A lot of people will focus on the weaknesses of this card and the opportunities for you to lose either part of it and it become much, much weaker. But ultimately, even in the worst case scenario, this is a very, very strong card. And the potential for it to do even more, I like a lot. So I'm pretty happy with how Titan Strike turned out. So up next is my second warrior weapon here. I don't even know if I can talk about this one without laughing. I'm calling this one the Blazing War Axe. This is a legendary warrior weapon. It's a 2-mana 3/2, which does sound a little familiar, I'll admit. And it has an effect. This weapon always appears in your mulligan. So anytime you start a game, much like quests always appear in your mulligan, the Blazing War Axe would always appear in your mulligan. And if you haven't picked up on this quite yet, this is a little bit of a meme card, because I am clearly poking fun at Fiery War Axe, the pre-nerf version that was a 2-mana, 3/2 weapon that seemingly always appeared in Warriors mulligans because they always had it on turn 2. But this would just be formalizing that concept and making it real. The Blazing War Axe would actually do that. And this would be a little bit of a throwback and a love letter to the Fiery War Axe of old. It would clearly be poking fun at Blizzard, so they would never make a card like this, I don't think. But it would be incredibly strong. Fiery War Axe was already maybe the best weapon in the game just because it gave you so much consistency in the early game and the ability to go 2 for 1 with basically anything that was played in the first few turns. That was incredibly strong. It was also good just as an aggro weapon because it packed a lot of damage into 2 mana. And Blazing War Axe would be exactly that, but it would be even better because you'd always have it when you started the game. And you only run 1, of course, so it's not like you risk getting 2 of these. So it would be just that little much better to make up for the fact that it's a legendary, because it needs to be really strong. So a little bit of a joke card, but honestly, a pretty cool design, and I think maybe even a fair design. It would be, again, very, very powerful, but at least predictable, and you could play around it a little more consistently because you'd know they've always have it if it becomes a part of the meta, which it almost certainly would. So half joke, but half something I would actually be thrilled if it made an appearance in Kobolds and Catacombs. So now I want to move on to my Druid weapon, and this is the Cythe of Elune, yet another artifact weapon from the Legion expansion. This time around, it's a 3-mana 0/3 once again because this is a class which does not have weapons, even though Druid does often get to attack. Of course, they don't have any weapons in their set, and I wanted to stick to that 0 attack line that Blizzard mentioned when discussing these weapons. So, of course, the most obvious weapon for Druid would be some sort of claw, because they do use claws, and they often do melee attack with those claws. But I wanted to go a bit of a different direction, because they already have so many cards about attacking, all the different bites and gnashes and all those cards. And I went with the Cythe here instead, which is a balanced Druid weapon, which is more of the spell casting side of thing, the Moonfire world. And that's exactly what I wanted to do here with Cythe of Elune. And I also borrowed a little bit here from the upgraded spells, the spell stones we've seen introduced with Kobolds and Catacombs. So, all of that said, Cythe of Elune here has a battle cry that adds a new moon spell to your hand. Now, you might be wondering what on earth is a new moon spell, and this is an idea that is also borrowed from the actual effect of the Cythe of Elune in Legion. And here is new moon, and in fact, all of the other moon spells that are a part of Cythe of Elune's effect. So, new moon, as you'll see right above me, is a spell that deals 2 damage, and then removes 1 durability from your Cythe of Elune, right? And then it also adds a half moon spell to your hand. So it's a 1 mana, deal 2, sort of an arcane blast card. It can go face or it can go towards minions. It's, kind of a super moonfire, if you will. And as soon as you cast it, you get the second aspect of the spell, which is a half moon. And this is a 2 mana, deal 4 damage spell, which is really, really good. That's very strong. That's super cheap damage, right? That's better than something like Shadow Bolt. It can also go face. And that also, whenever you cast Half Moon, removes the durability from your Cythe of Elune. So by the time you've cast New Moon and Half Moon, your Cythe of Elune is down to 1 durability. And then you add a Full Moon card to your hand. And Full Moon, you'll note the theme here. We keep doubling the numbers. This is a 4 mana, deal 8 damage card. So strictly better than Fireball. Really, really powerful. But again, it removes 1 durability from your Cythe of Elune. And it adds an Elune's Moon spell to your hand. So this is like the Super Moon. And Elune's Moon is an 8 mana, deal 16 damage spell. But here's the catch. In order to cast Elune's Moon, you have to have the Cythe of Elune equipped. But the problem is, the first 3 spells, of course, expire the durability on your Cythe of Elune. They each remove 1 durability. And it only has 3 durability. So you have to somehow, if you ever want to use your Elune's Moon, you either have to create a second copy of Cythe of Elune somehow, or you have to give it an extra durability with a card like Captain Greenskin. And I think this is a really interesting challenge because, of course, Elune's Moon is ridiculous. It's like a super duper Pyroblast. And, of course, if you add up all the damage here on all of these cards, you'll note it does exactly 30 damage. So if you could somehow pull off the full Cythe of Elune combo, you could just kill a 30 health opponent. Also, you'll note the first 3 cards, New Moon, Half Moon, and Full Moon, do a total of 14 damage, which for anybody who has played Druid in Hearthstone for very long knows that 14 damage is sort of a magic number for Druids in the past with their old Force of Nature, Savage, or combo that I wanted to bring back to life a little bit, because if you play Cythe of Elune and New Moon, Half Moon, and Full Moon all in a single turn, you can do 14 face damage in a single turn as a 1-card combo, which sort of pays honor to the combo of old, and in fact, might just be a little bit too strong. I'll keep that in mind. It's very, very good to be able to do 14 damage guaranteed on turn 10 without any sort of counterplay. So that's scary. That's maybe the one point of contention in this entire video. If you have any that you should point out and complain about, I'll just give you the tip there. There's your free comment complaint for the day. But I still think it would feel okay because this is a legendary weapon. You do have to build your deck in certain ways. If you play this earlier in the game, for instance, it's sometimes just a dead 3-mana card, and that's a large tempo sacrifice. Nonetheless, I really like the progression here. You know, if you play it on turn 5, you can only play Cythe and New Moons. It's a little slower. It takes a little while to build up some steam. But if it all works out, it all pans out, it's a very, very powerful kind of card. And your opponent sort of gets to feel this impending sense of doom and so on and so forth. Sure, it could be a little bit broken. I'll let the final design team at Blizzard tweak the numbers to make it feel more balanced. Maybe, for instance, you just cost Cythe of Elune at 4 mana to reduce the ability to pull it off in a single turn. That'd probably be fine. I'm more focused on the story and the idea and the concept, which I'm really happy with. I think Cythe of Elune would be a lot of fun, a very strong card for Druid, which doesn't necessarily need strong cards. I know, I'm not trying to buff Druid, I'm just thinking of this card kind of in a vacuum as far as the meta is concerned, because I'd love to see this one. I think it's a really cool new spin on Druid that I'd like to see. And then finally, I have one last card here. This is another Paladin card. This is Valinor, another legendary weapon from World of Warcraft. This time around, this is from the Ulduar raid in Wrath of the Lich King. This is a 5-mana 3/2 weapon, and really a pretty simple effect here that whenever your hero attacks, you give all friendly characters Divine Shield. So another Divine Shield interaction sort of card for Paladin. But note there specifically it says friendly characters, not friendly minions. The distinction being that I want to introduce Divine Shield for heroes in Hearthstone, and this would be the first card to do that. So you could give your hero Divine Shield. It would work exactly like it works for minions now, that as soon as that Divine Shield takes any sort of damage, the Divine Shield is popped. So if you use this weapon right away and you attack a minion, for instance, you would pop your Divine Shield while attacking that minion with Valinor, but of course you wouldn't take damage, so it would sort of be like giving yourself immunity while attacking. It would look a bit like Shadowblade in that regard, but ultimately different, because if you didn't attack a minion, say you just attacked face instead, you would still be giving your hero a Divine Shield that lived through the turn, and the next attack would be negated. So you could just go ahead and pressure face and hit for 3, give your board of small stuff Divine Shield, and that, let's say, 8/8 on the board that tried to attack you and kill you next turn would just be completely denied by your Divine Shield. That 8 damage would be wiped away. You would take 0 damage instead. And of course, Valinor does have 2 charges here, so you could do this effect twice. And that's very, very powerful. Don't underestimate giving Divine Shield to things. We've seen the value in that sort of things like Murlocs with Gentle Megazord, for instance, can be totally absurd. But Valinor allows you to do that with any kind of minion on board, so it's much more flexible in the kinds of decks that it can be run in. It's also just attached to a solid little 3/2 weapon. So you're basically paying 2 mana for this very powerful, super powerful Divine Shield effect. And that's really good for a legendary weapon. So even if it only goes off once, you're still getting something good. If it manages to go off twice, that's probably a game-winning kind of play, which is cool. I like that a lot. And I will note that this is a bit of a win more card. Like, it's not that great if you're behind, but it's still, in other words, if you had 0 minions on the board, but it still works because you do get some value out of it by giving even just your hero Divine Shield. that's powerful in and of itself. So even when you're behind, Valinor still does have some strengths. And I should mention, of course, this also ties into the effect of Valinor in actual World of Warcraft, which gives shields to your party, so on and so forth. So ultimately, I think a fitting card for Paladin, and yet another one that I'd like to see. And there you go. Those were 10 custom legendary weapons as created by yours truly. I obviously want to hear everything you guys have to say about these cards. Which ones are broken? Cythe of Elune. Which ones aren't quite good enough? I want to hear every single thought you have. I'd love to see your insights. And on top of that, what legendary weapons do you guys think will be in the new expansion? What ones didn't make the cut that seem perfectly fitting from a thematic standpoint or just iconic for their class? Whatever it might be, share those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.